Okay, so like I said, my philosophy is about hope, understanding, and direction. And before I get into the IEPs and accommodation, I always just like to have a little bit of an overview of dyslexia because I think people have an understanding of what dyslexia is, but there are a few things that these all these are some kids with dyslexia have this um, some signs, and some of them are very obvious, and other ones you may not know. So I thought I would just share some of the highlighted ones. One is some kids with dyslexia have trouble with word recall. And what that looks like is they might want to say something about a red truck that puts out fires, and they know exactly what it looks like, and they know exactly what they're trying to say. They could even say the word, but the word fire truck doesn't come to their mind. And you might start seeing that more once you recognize it, but that's a very typical sign of some kids with dyslexia. Some kids with dyslexia have trouble remembering names. You know, my boys would always say things like, I have a new best friend. And I would say, well, what's his name or their name? And they couldn't tell me. So just sort of recognizing that is helpful in coaching your kid in ways of remembering things. Sensitivity to certain tactile feelings. Some kids with dyslexia have tactile problems. They don't necessarily like certain labels or certain way clothes feels. Some kids have trouble with sequencings, days of the weeks, months of the year, you know, figuring out different ways that you can play games to help kids remembering those things. Some kids with dyslexia have difficulty in organizing their time management, prioritizing tasks. Some kids have trouble telling right from left. Some kids with dyslexia need movement. So they need to wiggle their toe, they need to stand up, they need to be tapping a toy. Some kids might have trouble with their fine motor control, like a pencil grip. So, you know, it's not all kids with dyslexia, but some. So it's not always just about being able to decode. One of the other things I like to talk about too is whether it's a learning disability or a learning difference. You know, a lot of times being an advocate is about having the positive discussion with your child or with people in their world, whether it's their peers or teachers or people you're talking with. So talking about a learning difference makes it a lot easier for people to understand. But in the world of education, dyslexia is a learning disability. And often we have to use those terms in order to get the funding or get the accommodation that we need. So don't be, regardless of what you're calling it, whether it's a learning difference or a learning disability, they're both true. And it sometimes just sets the tone for your meeting if you start using the word learning difference, even though we know that it's a learning disability. So getting into IEPs. IEP is a legal document, and there's sort of 5 stages to an IEP. And the first one is gathering information. And so often the teachers or educators in your world are the people gathering that information, getting work samples, assessments, but also as a parent, you might have a lot of relevant information. So before the IEP meeting, you know, if there's things that you think are relevant, send them to your educators to help them have that information, because your child might be different at home than they are at school. And this information can really help put an IEP together that's going to be useful and helpful for your student. IEPs set directions, they set the future for your students' learning. It's an independent education plan. That means it's very unique and it's setting that direction. It's developed by a team. There's the implementation stage. So the third stage is developing, and that's where you have your IEP meeting and you work together to develop that program. The next stage is the implementation. And you as parents play a major role in making sure that your IEP is implemented the way that it's been discussed, and that you're able to measure it, and also reviewing it and updating it as necessary. So there's things to know about an IEP. So an IEP is an individual education plan for your child. The team consists of parents, teachers, TAs. It's really important to think about your teaching assistant that's working with your student. You know, if you think about a classroom teacher having 28 to 30 students, the TA that's working most regularly with your child, if your child has a TA or at least a part of a TA, they may know your child better than the classroom teacher does. So don't forget to include your TAs in your meetings. Your resource teacher also might be a really strong connection with your student, a school psychologist, and if applicable, the student can be involved depending on the age of your student. You can also excuse people from IEP meetings. That's not something that's done typical, but if you do have somebody that's in your world that you feel isn't going to be positive and move things forward, that is a possibility. IEPs are working documents. They can be changed when necessary. So know that you have some really strong input into your IEPs. Oh, yes, I'm definitely sharing the slides afterwards. You can also slow down the meeting. So as you have so for myself, I think I've been to over 25 or between 25 and 30 IEP meetings with my kids. I can tell you that the first few IEP meetings were very emotional for me and really emotional for my husband. We would go together and, you know, I had more information than he did because I was the one at the school more often. And they became quite emotional. Towards the end, they were a lot easier. I knew what to expect. But if you are feeling that your emotions are getting the best of you, depending on what's happening, it's okay to slow the meeting down. It's okay to postpone the meeting. You are a major part of this meeting. And if you feel like you need a little bit of a break, it's okay to say, you know what, can we just have a 5-minute break and I can regroup? Or I don't think I have all the information. Can we postpone it and redo it? It's not something that happens often, but if you're in that moment, know that it's important for you to be present. And if you can't be, it's okay to slow it down. Goals are a huge part of your IEP meeting. So part of the IEP meeting is creating a plan, but that plan has to be measurable. You have to know that it's working for your student. So when you are in your IEP, talk about what the goals are. Talk about how we're going to assess whether or not these goals we have are being met and how we're going to measure them. So it could be something like using your reading assessment or your word count per minute assessment. It could be something about strategy towards behavior. You know, how often is homework being completed? Whatever your goal is, whatever you're trying to meet, make sure that you manage those goals and you know that there's a way to measure the goals. Finding out who's responsible for the goals. Is it something that you, the parent, is going to keep track of? Is it something that the classroom teacher is going to keep track of? Is it something that your TA has a responsibility? So just have a good understanding of what the goals are. And it is helpful to pick 3 or 4 goals that are key. You can have, IEPs can have a lot of goals, a lot of things that you're trying to achieve, especially if you have multiple subjects that you're dealing with. But if you can narrow it down to some key ones, it's really helpful to be able to work with those goals and teach your child what those goals are so they also can keep track and they can advocate for themselves. And know that your IEP is, it's a working session. And so what I mean by that is it's not a session where you are going to go and learn what the IEP is. The IEP meeting is for you to go and be prepared and to have some really good insight to what you want the outcomes to be. So do the work before you go. It'll make a huge difference to you when you're in your meeting. The other thing that I like to tell my clients is that you don't have to learn to educate your child. We have great educators and great teachers in our world. What your job as a parent is to learn to advocate for your child. And I think sometimes when this was told to me years ago by one of the tutors that my kids were working with, it really took a lot of weight off my shoulder because I knew I could learn to be an advocate. I was pretty certain I couldn't necessarily learn to teach my child how to read or do whatever the subject was. But learning how to be an advocate was something that I could do. And that gave me a lot of hope in the future. And so going from being led through this process to being the leader of supporting your child is a goal that I think is a really worthwhile goal. The other thing about IEPs, especially in the IEP meeting when your child is struggling, is we spend a lot of time on our child's weakness. But the truth is our childs often have a lot of strengths that we're not spending a lot of time in. And so make sure during your IEP you spend time on their strengths, because if your child is struggling to read, which a lot of dyslexic kids do, or students with dyslexia, or maybe they have dyscalculia and they have trouble with math, we don't often spend enough time on what they are good at and making sure the IEP gives room for that. So an example would be if you have a very a skilled artist and their part of their IEP is having them being taken out of the classroom for special learning. Well, make sure they're not being taken out of their art or their gym or whatever their program is. Maybe they're very musically inclined. You don't want them to be taken out of the courses that they are succeeding in. We want to find room for confidence and success, and spending time on what they're successful in and is during the IEP is a very valuable use of time. Okay, so how can you prepare for your IEP meeting? There's lots of different ways, but I sort of got 10 highlights that I think can be helpful for you in the future. So one of the things you want to do is make sure all of your discourse is in writing. So I know for some parents, you're seeing your teachers quite regular, especially in the elementary school, and it's easy to just have a conversation. But if you put everything in writing, then you know what you've received. They're sending you back the assessment. If you ever get into a time where things, you're not sure exactly why things are the way they are, and you'd like to see them different or handled differently, having things in writing makes a big difference. Ask for the recent evaluations before your meeting. So if they have been evaluated, if they've done an assessment or they've done any sort of, not assessment, that's not what I'm looking for, it's a, anyways, it's the word will come to me, but if they've done any sort of exams, make sure you get them before so that you can have that information before your IEP meeting. Brainstorm with your child, really get a good idea of what they're happy with, what's working at school, what are they struggling with, what are some of the things that they feel could be different. You can bring a support person to your IEP meeting. So if you know that you're going to be emotional, or if you've had some struggles and you yourself might have trouble at this style of meeting, don't feel like bringing somebody along is something that you can't do. You absolutely can bring a support person. You can request a translator. So if you need a translator, if English isn't your first language and everything is being done in English and you want a translator, you can request that. The most recent report card is helpful. Writing down your questions before your meeting. So what happens in these IEP meetings, and for those who've been there before, you might be able to relate, as you get into these meetings, you start ticking along, and then all these great questions that you have don't get answered because you've forgotten them. So write them down, and write them down in order of importance for you, like things that you think are the most important, so that when you're bringing these things up, you have a good idea of what you're looking for. Writing down your goals for your child. Like I was saying, if art's important, if music's important, just have a good idea of the things that you want to highlight for your child. Keeping an open mind in these meetings too. Your child might behave differently at school than they do at home. So just being open to some of the feedback that you're getting. And most importantly, being nice. And I know we all try to be nice all the time, but sometimes these meetings can be difficult, especially if you feel like your child isn't thriving. So being nice it's helpful. I can't say I've always been nice, but I try. So bringing your child to the IEP meeting, I thought that perhaps the best person to talk to about this would be Dr. Campbell. Jennifer, if you're willing to speak to that about a child's development and at what point they can really engage in managing their own education.
I think you have it there. As 14 to 16 years old, I think I would recommend the same as you. Sometimes there's younger youth that are very mature and really interested in this, and sometimes there's older youth that are very sensitive and don't want to talk about it. So I think it's individual, but the opportunity to be involved is important because we want them to carry that on and learn how to advocate, especially before they transition into uni, where they're going to need to do that on their own.
And Dr. Campbell, there was somebody suggesting that maybe it doesn't hurt to bring your younger students, like 12 and like 10 to 12, to the first 10 minutes of a meeting, just to, so that they understand all these people are meeting on their behalf and for them to take ownership. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I mean, I can speak to the meetings I do where feedback's around assessments. I work in the private industry, so I don't attend IEPs. I'm not a school psychologist. But sometimes we'll have the youth, I'll meet with the parents first to give a feedback session around their psych ed assessment. And then once the parents have all their questions answered and have adjusted to the diagnoses or the findings, then we'll invite the youth in and give a youth-friendly explanation of what's happened. Yeah. And helping and role modeling to the parents sometimes on how to talk to their kids about this. Like you said, a difference. It's very important to present it as this is knowledge that's going to help us. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. This is information we can use to move forward and help the client.
Yeah, and there was one question before the session in regards to when do you tell your child they have dyslexia? Um, and is that something that there is an age, or is it just something as soon as you can, you tell them?
Right. I always see like mental health and wellness the same as it would you tell your child that they had pneumonia?
Right,
It's not necessarily a stigma thing. If we hide it and don't want to talk about it, we're acting like it's shameful, and
right.
it's not.
Yes,
So
yes.
it's important to just I really like Liz Angoff. I don't know if you're familiar with her website, which has lots of videos and links and handouts for parents on how to talk to their kids about these things. Um, there's plenty of
Yeah.
others. Yeah,
Would you mind
I'm
putting that
sure.
name in the chat for us?
Sure, I can put the link to the website, and I'm sure Alicia probably has some also, some good things to share. But just learning how to get comfortable, and I don't think it's something to hide.
Yeah, yeah.
And it's often some kids just feel relief. They're like, now I know why. And they're like, thank you, Dr. Campbell. And I'm like, oh, wow. The little 7-year-old saying thank you for understanding better.
Yeah, thank you. That's always been our family's philosophy too. As soon as we could, we told and we talked about it very openly, very frequently, and that it was something that was just part of our family for sure.
Mhm.
So thank you for that.
You're
Um,
welcome.
for the people who don't have an
Doc?
IEP, oh, sorry.
Okay, I locked the patio door. I didn't know where you were.
Hi there. So for people who don't have an IEP, it's how do I get an IEP for my child? So you definitely have to find an advocate in the school. If you don't have an official diagnosis, if you haven't had a chance to have a psych ed eval that very specifically says you need one, and I know how long it takes nowadays to get a psych ed evaluation. Dr. Campbell, do you know what the wait time is right now for some of your clients?
For a psych ed, it's about a month and a half.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. So in
Yeah.
private Senate, it's not too bad. So as long as people are
It can ebb and flow. It can get after report cards, we get swamped and then it, slows down. So it goes up and down. Yeah.
yeah, I've got a question here.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that's fantastic, 1 month, but I also know that at the clinic that I've been at twice now, it was 18 months. And there's many
Hi,
other
Nadine.
clinics specifically in
Good, how are
British.
you?
I don't know about other provinces, but they're quite lengthy.
Yes.
They're quite lengthy. So it's fantastic that you have a short list, but I would say to lots of places
Uh-huh.
I've reached out to and others I know that they're quite lengthy.
Okay.
Yeah, I
I'm just
think
wondering if somebody can.
somebody's-
No, I saw Dua. And so I just put her diagnostic letter in her chart when I saw her, so you should have that.
it's whoever's on iPhone, we can hear your conversation.
Yeah, and I don't know how to.
There we go. There we go. They've got it.
Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so if you don't have and not everybody has a psych ed evaluation, and so sometimes you don't have to have a psych ed evaluation to have an IEP. You just have to have a need, and so it can be done through some sort of screening or assessments that you've done through your school. And if you feel that your child is not succeeding, and really what happens often with dyslexic kids, especially at the younger age, some of them are so smart that they're doing fine. Like they're 70, let's say they're 75% of the material. And often that won't trigger need for an IEP. But if you know that your child could be at 90% of the information and should be exceeding, but you just see them struggling, you might have to find an advocate in your school. Usually the classroom teacher is the one who starts pushing for the IEP. But if you're not getting that IEP and you know that your child is not as comfortable with the material as you think they should be, it's worthwhile having those discussions and finding an advocate. It might be the resource teacher, it could be the TA. It really has to come from the classroom teacher. But if you're not getting the help you need through your local classroom teacher, it could be something you go to the principal. So, obviously you don't want to elevate things initially, but if you're not getting the resources you need, you may have to take it to the next level. And that's part of advocating for your child's education. So the IEPs are a legal document. You're entitled to them if your child has a special needs or a learning disability. So if you know your child has a learning disability, you're absolutely entitled to an IEP. And the reason why the IEP is important is because that allows you to have your accommodations. And the accommodations are important in elementary school, really important in high school, critical in university. So, as you're going through teaching your child how to monitor their accommodations when they're younger in elementary makes it easier for high school and makes them very powerful in university. So it's all sort of a journey and a path, but it all starts with an IEP. Do you have any questions about the IEP? Before we get into the accommodations, I always want to just mention something briefly, and Alicia is always so much more articulate about this than I am. But a real big struggle in British Columbia is we don't have structured literacy programs as mandatory in our classrooms. We continue to have different programs across the province, balanced literacy versus structured literacy. There's so much information about this, and I really can't go into it at this stage. One of the best learnings is through a podcast called Sold a Story. Emily Hanford is an education reporter. She's done a 10 series podcast, and it will really help you understand the difference between what balanced literacy programs are and structured literacy programs. You must know what your teachers are teaching. You have to ask this question. And if they can't answer what literacy program they're teaching, just keep digging. But if you listen to this podcast, it'll give you a great amount of background knowledge so that you can ask the questions appropriately. So, and I'll send these slides, so for sure you'll have this information. So moving into accommodation. Oh, that's great, Alicia. Thank you very much. They're hosting one tonight. So does anybody have any questions about IEPs before we move on to accommodations? Okay, so for accommodations are really your best friend, your students' best friends. Accommodations, the way I like to think about it is if your child needed glasses and you came across somebody that said, nope, we're not allowed to use glasses, we're not going to accommodate vision problems, they're just going to have to just sort it out on their own. That would sound ridiculous. And that's something that would never happen. You would allow your child to wear their glasses. If you think of accommodations as the same sort of aid as visual aids, you can have that conversation very calmly with any teachers so that you can say, no, my child needs this accommodation. This is important for them. This is how they are going to be successful. So one of the things I want to talk about, and it's important for parents to understand, is the difference between accommodations and modifications. So accommodations, they don't change the expectation of your learning. They don't reduce the requirement of the tasks, and they don't change what the student is required to learn. Modifications are very different. So if your child's in grade 3, accommodations allow them to do the work in grade 3. If your child's in grade 10, it allows them to do the work in grade 10. It helps them to do that work. If somebody starts talking about a modification, that means they're reducing the amount of expectations of their learning. So that might mean that they're not going to learn exactly what they need to learn in grade 3. We're going to modify it to help them out, and they're going to learn half of grade 3. Okay, if that's what's necessary, but you've really got to ask that question, because they're going to go in grade 4 and they're going to need to know this information. So just make sure you understand that the modification is what you and your student and your educators are deciding on versus an accommodation. So I've got 10 different modifications or 10 different accommodations that I want to talk about. And please stop me at any time if you want more information about each accommodation. So the accommodation that I think is the most common for most dyslexic students, and it's the common thread throughout their whole schooling, is time, needing more time. And so what happens is, most dyslexic students can learn the information. It just takes them 4 times longer. Sometimes that number changes. Sometimes it's 3, sometimes it's 5. But typically, whatever they're learning, it's going to take them 4 times longer. What time does for them, it allows them to use all the information in a longer piece of time. So what can happen is that a child can have an exam, and it's an hour exam, and they just can't read it fast enough. They can't digest it fast enough. They're only going to do 50% of that exam. But if they're given 2 hours to do that exam, they can get through it. They can answer the questions. They're going to do much better without the time pressure. And Dr. Campbell, maybe you can talk to the idea of the testing when you test on a psych ed, timed evaluations versus untimed evaluations.
Yeah, we can see that when people struggle with time, their fluency scores. Fluency means a task that is timed when we're testing, that they can really struggle in just even getting going, knowing they're being timed. So often we'll test the limits, which means we'll note when the time limit was up, but we'll allow them to continue and see how they do past that time limit. And we can generally say, you know, the student does much better and knows how to do it and can get things done with double time allotted.
Yeah. And that's the other thing on the psych ed, when you're talking to your educational psychologist, there's a big difference between time and a half and double time. So I have two boys that are dyslexic. I have 3 in total, but 2 that are dyslexic, and they're very different dyslexic kids. They have completely different accommodations. My older son needed double time in almost everything. His dyslexia is, you know, he's borderline on a lot of his processing disorder. He had the most severe dyslexia compared to the other one. The other one only has time and a half. So in a university setting, in high school setting, having double time is very unusual, and you have to request it. So that makes a huge difference for him on his exams. So just note that time and a half and double time. If your psych ed just says more time, it has to eventually become more specific when they get into the older grades. Word banks. This is something that if you have a dyslexic student and you haven't started talking about word banks, I really highly recommend it. So what this looks like is our students that are dyslexic often have trouble with word recall or word recreation. And so for this example, animal cell, your student might be able to label this perfectly if they have the word bank. But for them to recreate all these words, I would guess it's almost impossible. It's hard. It's really hard for them to recreate it. Some educators might say, well, that's not fair. Then they have all the answers. No, because that is not the mastery. The mastery is, can you label the animal cells? That's the mastery. My son being able to recreate all these words is impossible, and that's not the mastery. I'm not asking him to do that. You're asking him to label it. So if you don't have word banks as an option right now in your IEP, it's something you should talk about. Most educators are really happy to help you out, even on spelling tests, believe it or not. You can have word banks for spelling tests because the idea is, can you recognize the word and recreate it? Well, if you have a word bank, you're going to have to pick out apple, strawberry, watermelon. You're going to have to pick out those words to be able to recreate them. And if you go back to the idea of time, having time as a factor, having the word there and being able to pick it out and spell it is part of the mastery. So, it's word banks are great all the way through. University, they don't allow for word banks, but high school, you can get word banks. And especially in some of the more complicated courses like chemistry or science or any of those other ones where words are, glossary is difficult. Access to audio material, text to speech, listening to audio books, reading out questions out loud to students. This is something where parents, I think, always struggle on what's the balance between being able to help your student, read for them, and let them read on their own. And what I found is that there's time when you're wanting to have reading material for your students and you're wanting them to practice read. There's other time where they just really need to know the material. And let's say you have a child who's learning to read and they're in grade 2 or grade 4, and you're wanting them to be able to understand a story. And the goal of the exercise is to do a book report. Well, them reading that story out loud on their own is not the goal. The goal is the book report. So you reading the story to them so they hear the story, they get the context, then they can do the book report. There's other times where you're practicing reading and you're working with a one-on-one tutor or you're working at home on your own. But if the goal is to do the book report, they need to get the information. And the quicker they can get the information, that helps them with the time again. Any questions about the text to speech? I know we had a lot of questions on that when people were sending in their reports. The other thing is that when students are working with their exams, whether it's in middle school or high school, being allowed to have the exam question read to them, especially in math, dyslexics often have trouble with words like and or. And if you're doing a math question that has and or and you miss that word, that changes your answer completely. So even though they're able to see it, having it read to them will make a big difference. Scribing and typing versus handwriting. Dr. Campbell, do you have any, what is your thoughts on typewriting for young students with dyslexia?
I believe we're on the same page here. And once they hit grade 7 and 8, that's what they're doing every day.
Yeah.
So I think for some of us who are older, it seems a little odd because that's not how we grew up, but it's just the standard norm now. It's a great skill to have.
Yeah, I think the summer between grade 4 and grade 5 is a great time to do a typing course. Usually they're about 6 weeks. Often you can get courses that are specific to dyslexics to help them. Speedy typing, I think, is one name, and I'll find a few other names and I'll add it to them. But teaching your kids how to type is really important for them because they are going to need to type their whole life. And the faster they can type, again, it helps with their time. The other thing is, don't be afraid to scribe for your child. So they're going to have projects, especially in the earlier grades, where they've got these great ideas, and those great ideas get reduced into words that, like, instead of saying, I had a fantastic weekend, they say, I had a fun weekend, because they can spell fun. They can't spell fantastic. So if you're scribing for your students, it really allows their thoughts and ideas to come out, and don't hesitate to scribe. And having them retype your scribe, that's not even necessary for a lot of educators. If you have an educator pushing back on you, saying that, that's not in his handwriting or her handwriting, well, the mastery is, I scribe for my child. I'm not creating this information, they're creating this information. And now with speech to text, they can do it all by themselves. And one of the greatest things that you can do is help your kid become a great editor. So if they're doing speech to text, you're going to see the text on the device that they're on. And then spell check is great. If you haven't used Grammarly or don't have Grammarly on all their devices, I would highly recommend it. It's a free program. It helps them recognize any spelling mistake and grammar mistake. And I think even the monthly cost is only $30 a month if you want the advanced one. But a lot of kids don't need the advanced Grammarly. The free one is perfectly fine. And then they can become a great editor too on everything that they're doing. Access to classroom notes. So a couple things about classroom notes. One of the things that really helps a lot of dyslexic students is white space. So if you have an expanded text on a white space, it can be as easy as just photocopying at 127%, for example. That just gives all of the text on a page just a bit more space, and it's really helpful for younger students. So if you think about getting a book that's small print and you start reading it, you have to kind of really settle in and go, okay, here we go. Well, imagine that's what it's like for a dyslexic kid. So if you stretch out all the text, so there's a bit more white space around the text, they can zone in a lot easier on the text that they're doing. If you're a classroom educator can't do this, this is something you could do ahead of time. If your classroom teacher is cooperating with you and sending you the notes ahead of time, you can have it all expanded for your student. Or if you're somebody who's willing to go in to the school, you can do the expansion. I mean, there's a ways around it if you have the time and a cooperation with the classroom teachers. Smart pens, we've never used them. Some people say they work great. They record all the information. They're a little bit complicated to use. So what happens is they're recording as the student is writing. So the student is writing, and then that record the information. I think it's an older student that can use it effectively. They weren't around. They were just sort of starting when our kids were in school, and so they never adapted. Does anybody use one now? Anybody in the group that has one now? It's worthwhile looking into them, but I think they are a little complicated right now. But they do record all the information. So if your teacher's open to being recorded, that's something that is very helpful. Students, preloading your student is great. If you can get the information before the class, so let's say they're going to do a class on animal cells, for example. If you know that ahead of time and you can read it with your student the day before or the night before, where you're reading it out loud and then it's being layered in the classroom, that really helps them to absorb the information. So getting the information before is helpful. If not, having the teacher give you textbooks to take home so that you have them at home. I know that textbooks are becoming, there's not as many as there used to be, because now they're just able to photocopy and hand out the information. That in itself can be tricky, because then these photocopied piece of paper have to find the right place, which often can be problematic. There's also a recording that app that translates. It's called otter.ai. I know schools are starting to be a bit nervous about this recording, but it might be something that works for your student, especially depending on the grade that they're in. if they can take this AI tool, basically what it is it's a recording, and then that recording becomes it's transcribed. So you can use that too. So that's information. One of the teachers at our last meeting that we had, he actually has 5 or 6 kids that have IEPs, and he takes photos of the classroom notes every single day and emails those 5 parents. So the parents and the kids all have the classroom notes. So that's really a wonderful thing that he does. Not all educators are going to be able to do that for you, but if you can, doesn't hurt to ask. One of the things that is really helpful is color coding notes. If your student is not color coding their notes right now, it's something that is a really great habit to get into, just from a habit perspective, and ultimately it'll be very helpful in the later years. And the reason why that's important is dyslexics tend to be very visual people. And so they may not necessarily remember all these different words, but if they're color coded, they can associate it with the color and go, oh, that word was blue, oh, right, the blue word was this word. So that can be very helpful. I just want to show you what that looks like. So if you're a typical learner, you might be able to learn these 4 parts of a STEM quite simply. That may not be the case if you're a dyslexic learner. You might have to do something like this. So the leaves are green, the stem is green, the roots are brown, the seed is yellow. That's going to help me remember. That might be an easy way for a student to remember, and they can put it into categories of color. That may be not enough for a student to remember. They might have to write the words out. Leaves, stem is above ground, below ground is seeds and roots. I know 2 of the words start with S, 1 starts with an R, 1 starts with an L. I can remember that on my test. Hopefully your teacher will give them a word bank and they don't have to recreate these words. However, if they do, they may have to go to the next level, which is recreating all those words in clay. So if you think about what a typical learner needs to do to learn this information versus a dyslexic learner, you can see why it takes so much more time, and there's so much more layering for a dyslexic student to be able to be successful in this particular exam. And then if you extrapolate that over every exam, every class, you could see why the time is so important. Reading out loud in class. Has anybody run into this problem, or are educators now being quite thoughtful about this? So in your IEP, it is absolutely reasonable to say my student will not read out loud in class under no circumstance, unless they want to and they're prepared ahead of time. So there's a big difference between a child being able to read and learning to read and then being asked to read out loud. There's so many things that can go wrong with the surprise read out loud situation. And what we're trying to do with our dyslexic students is build confidence. Reading out loud in class, unprepared, will never make them confident. This will always be a very uncomfortable, difficult thing. It still is for me today. I can present in front of many people, no problem. But if you want me to read out loud, you better give me a ton of notice, because I won't do it. It's just too difficult. Spelling and grammar. Even in university, spelling and grammar doesn't count for students with dyslexia if you have it in your accommodation. So this is something that I understand that it's important to learn to spell. I understand that grammar is important. But if you're a student with dyslexia and spelling and grammar is going to be part of your learning difference, there are things like spell check, and yes, students are expected to do really good editing, and we can work hard to make them better at their editing, but you really can't grade them for this. You can't reduce the marks. And the reason why this becomes important is when your student's in high school and you have a teacher or an educator that's really giving you a bit of a hard time, what can happen here is you go from a 75, an 80, let's say you get an 80% on an exam instead of a 75 because of spelling and grammar. if you needed that 80% to keep your grade level at a level that you can get into certain universities, and it's because of this spelling and grammar that your marks have come down, this is something where you and your dyslexic student, your student with dyslexia, really has to advocate for themselves that these points do not go against them, that this does not count against their grade. Did they master the topic? Did they write a paper that had all the information? Did they get the core concepts? Yes or no? If you're marking me for spelling, I have an accommodation. Spelling does not count. You can't take grades off. And if they learn that at a younger age and start advocating for themselves, it really becomes helpful in their high school years when all the percentages do count, and it does make a difference. French as a second language. I'm only familiar with British Columbia. I'm not sure how it is in all the other provinces. Alicia, maybe you know the answer to this question, but in British Columbia, you do not have to have a second language if you have a psych ed evaluation to get into universities.
In most places, like in Ontario, I'll say anyway, you don't need to have a second language to get into university, full stop. Like you only need to take second language instruction in Ontario up until grade 9. That's the last time that French is mandatory. I do know many families who have successfully advocated to have their kids removed. That said, I would say that, you know, dyslexia is not a barrier in and of itself to learning French as a second language. There are a lot of accommodations that can be put in place there, and there are a lot of kids who are successful at learning second languages who are dyslexic as well. But it really comes down to the child, right? I think with everything, it comes down to the child and the individual situation. So I wouldn't make a hard and fast rule there. But that is something that some parents I know have explored that because they felt that was the right thing for their child, and in a variety of different provinces have managed to have that requirement removed. So all of these things are flexible.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the other things too about the second language requirement, I mean, if I would have been able to have the gift of French or another second language, I would have loved that. And so if you can give that gift to your child, that's a wonderful thing. But one of the things about a second language is it's again about the time. So if you can remove your child from their second language, whether it's Spanish or French, that gives them time to do their homework. Because what happens is that dyslexic kids have to do things, everything takes so much longer. And so their schooling goes from, 8:30 to 3:30, but then their homework takes so much longer after that. And so if they can do some of that homework during their second language block, it allows them to be able to do all their other extracurriculars or other things, or just family time at home. And so if it's too much, you as a parent will know, and this is something that you could do to add to your IEP to remove them from the second language requirement if you're not wanting that, or if they're not wanting their second language requirement. Low distraction space. I think this is one thing that makes a big difference for a lot of kids is writing exams in a quieter spot. So it can even be in your home or in the school, but allowing your kids to have a spot to write their exams or even do some of their work, and even allowing them to have headphones in the classroom if that's what it requires for them to focus. So that's something that you can write into your accommodations. Most schools do have a specialized room for this purpose, but if you don't have one, see if you can accommodate it. One of the things that sometimes happens to kids is they get to do their exams during recess, which is a terrible idea. Recess is not when they should be doing specialized exams or have extra time. Recess is a time for them to go out and connect with their friends and just blow off some steam. So they will sometimes need to have a separate room. And what that can look like for a school is a TA has to take the student and be with the student. And yes, it's part of their accommodation. So it just has to be written in. But if you find out that your student is being held back at recess always to do their extra work, that's definitely a conversation you should be having to say, this is not the appropriate time for my student to be doing this work. Behavior modification or behavior management. This is a great place to put this into your IEP and have your accommodations. So these are very interesting things that you can add to your for your child's success. So taking more frequent breaks might be something they need to do. Having a behavior book that you bring back and forth to school so that you know that your student is getting their homework done, and you're sort of communicating this way with the classroom teacher, so you're both signing off on it. Being allowed to take breaks between class or between tasks, that's sometimes something that we need to do. Creating a fidget device. So my middle son ended up going to a school for dyslexic kids in grade 3. So grade 3, grade 4, grade 5. In his typical elementary school, it was a typical school. You had to all sit in your desk. All the kids were there. He was a kid who needed movement to think. And so it was always a complicated conversation because he always wanted to be standing up and doing his work while he was standing. As soon as he went to the school for dyslexic kids, of course, all the kids had all of these behavior managements in place. And so, it was probably distracting for a person who didn't need it, but for these kids who need it, some would have a bouncy seat, some would have something they could bounce under their desk, some had fidgets, some had other devices that they could use just to give them a bit of break and a bit of movement. So if movement is important for your student, just make sure that that's something that's allowed, and you can build that in as accommodation. Here's some other types of accommodations that are available. So manipulatives in class. So if your student is learning math or something with manipulatives, those same manipulatives should be in the exam. They should be able to have those exact same manipulatives in the exam. If that's how they're learning, they should be able to use them for the exam. You think about using pies, pieces in a pie. They should be able to transfer that over to exam. Reduce classroom schedule. So it can't always happen in an elementary school, but having it in a high school, not having all of their courses all at one time can be really helpful. Sitting close to the teacher, that could be an accommodation that you want. You want your student to be right next to the teacher. Dyslexic font, it's not proven by science. It's something that exists. It is something that you can put on devices. If your student finds that it's helpful, then that's helpful. Calculators, if appropriate, that's something that students should be allowed to use. Graphic organizers are very helpful from a visual perspective. The other thing that I don't have listed here, but it's formulas. So my oldest son has formulas written right into his assessment, and in university in particular, he probably wouldn't pass all of his accounting and economics classes if he didn't have his formulas allowed. And so especially in high school, having formulas allowed in exams can make a huge difference instead of kids having to recreate those formulas in their heads. So adding that can be very helpful. The one thing about accommodations, I love this little picture, is that the sooner you can get your kids understanding their accommodations and advocating for themselves, the better. And what that looks like is starting young, picking one accommodation that they can focus on, and then building on that over time. So by the time they get to high school, they're very calm and confident when they go up to their teachers and say, oh, I'm sorry, you did X, Y, and Z, and that's not part of my accommodation. Is it okay if we were to do this? Or part of my accommodation is double time on my exam. So I still actually have another 30 minutes. And so, if you think from a younger child in grade 3 per se, or grade 2, it could be something as saying, I need all of my documents expanded. Can you please expand this test for me so that I have more white space? So just starting young is really helpful for your child to eventually learn to advocate for themselves. So that in itself, self-advocating, is something that, in addition to everything else a dyslexic student has to learn, this is probably one of the most important things for a student to learn, because when they get to university, their self-advocating and their accommodations are going to be absolutely imperative for their success. And you as a parent can't advocate for them anymore. I mean, you probably shouldn't be, but we still do. You're not allowed to. You don't even have access to them, to the universities, to the people that the students have to do it all themselves. Dr. Campbell, do you have any comments on self-advocacy for students?
I think just echoing what you said and teaching them how to do that. I think initially it may come across aggressive, and just practicing how to do that in an assertive way. And just communicating that with the parents and really being clear on what the accommodations are. I think picking top 3, like you'd said, to focus on, because when you get to uni, yeah, they're pretty much on their own.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and it's just really an exciting thing when you start seeing your child advocate for themselves in a really polite, calm way, where they're not anxious about it. They're just like, I know I'm entitled to this accommodation. I know it's going to make a difference for me. And I'm happy to wait for the accommodation. So if we have to redo the exam another day, that's fine. We can do it another day, but the accommodation is necessary. And I have had clients whose children have opted out of exams because they didn't get their accommodations. And what that looks like is, no, I'm not going to write this exam right now because I don't have my accommodations. And they're entitled to opt out of exams without their accommodations, especially in university. So that's something that once they're in the accessibility centers at the university, they can opt out for those reasons. Well, thank you very much. That is the end of my formal presentation. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. And so if anybody has any questions on anything that we didn't cover or anything you'd like to ask, this is a great time to ask any of those questions. I'm sure you have lots of questions.
I have a question in regards, I don't know if you can answer this, but in regards to psych eds, do they expire, and do they need to be redone for going into university or the next phase of education?
Dr. Campbell, do you want to answer that question?
We do suggest if you get a psych ed early to come back in 2 or 3 years and get reassessed, especially once interventions have been put in place. We want to see if there's been changes made. Also, things get harder, academics can get more difficult as the years go on. So we usually suggest around the transition to high school as well as the transition to uni. A lot of universities want an updated, more recent psych ed before students go there. And we work a lot with the students going to university, so they're usually getting it done near the end of grade 12, because you want that all set up before classes start. The UBC, once classes start, you can't even, they won't even help you. So this is something you need to prep and preload before you get there.
Okay, sorry, can I ask another question about the second language? So I do know in BC, you do not need a second language to graduate high school, but there are certain universities that want a second language, UBC being one of them. The reason I'm asking is my son wants to be an electrical engineer. So does anyone on this forum have any insight, like you said, that you can ask to have the second language dropped? Has anyone been successful in that as far as UBC?
So I can answer that question. My son's in engineering at Queen's, my third son. And yes, but you absolutely need to have a psych ed evaluation, and it has to be current within 3 years of applying. And UBC will accept it, but you have to be registered with their accessibility program. And like Dr. Campbell said, when you're working with the universities, you don't come in September and start working with their accessibility programs. You start working with them in June and July. So long before the student gets to the university. And so what's been happening with the psych ed evaluations, my one son had 4 in his education career and my other one had 3. And, you know, if you think about my kids being 20, 21, and 19, things have changed a lot. However, a lot of the high schools now don't require a psych ed. They're very good to have, but they don't require them anymore to get into high school, especially if you've had one before, and especially if you've been diagnosed with dyslexia. They're super helpful, and they're also very helpful for your child to understand at the stage for them to read them themselves. Because often with psych ed evaluations, they highlight where you struggle, but they really highlight where you don't struggle. So it really gives kids a good understanding of where their success can be. When you're going to university, you absolutely need a psych ed. It has to be current. So if you can only afford X amount of psych eds in your lifetime, because they keep getting more expensive, then you really need to think about getting the one right in grade 11 or grade 12, especially that one. That one's a really critical one to take you through university.
Okay, thank you.
And our students in training, Sam here, O'Brien is one of them, our doctoral students in training offer reduced cost psych eds for people that don't have benefits or have any financial obstacles. It still is expensive because it's time consuming and the tests and everything cost money, but it's at least 40% less than typical.
And Dr. Campbell, are you doing them online now, or are they all in person?
We haven't gotten there yet. So we're in person. We'll do psychodiagnostic online and personality assessments and vocational assessments, career assessments, but with the cognitive assessments, I haven't quite gotten there tech wise. Yeah. It would be nice to for people in remote communities, but some people do. There are, if somebody's needing that, let me know. I know a couple of psychologists that do that.
I could jump in on that one as well. I'll say that through our parent support line, we support a lot of families where they have students that had an older assessment that are going into university. And we've pushed back a lot on the requirement of the university to have that updated assessment. And I don't think that we have been unsuccessful yet. You know, we've had, like, nope, this kid was diagnosed with dyslexia in grade 3 and the kid is still dyslexic, you need to accommodate. So we do support with that sort of thing. So if you're having that conversation and you're getting that pushback, email us at info@dyslexiacanada.org. And we have 2 people actually that kind of work in that space a lot, and they can help with that. From a human rights perspective, they can't actually require the assessment before accommodation, which is why high schools and public education have really started to offer the accommodations without an assessment, because there's very clear human rights precedents for that. The universities have not really picked up on that in the same way, but that's something that we are really pushing back on as a national advocacy organization, because they're expensive. Like, the information you get, it's useful, it's great. If you can afford that, wonderful. But if you can't, your child should not be denied accommodation in university. So again, if you're having any challenges with that, please reach out and we can support with making sure that that is not the boat that you end up in.
Alicia, can I just ask you what that looks like? So they contact Dyslexic Canada, they let them know that they're looking for support for advocacy, and then you help them speak to the universities.
Yeah. So we have a volunteer network. It's called Dyslexia Compass is the name of it now. And we have a number of different volunteers there. We have one staff person, and then we have a bunch of volunteers. And we have one volunteer who actually works at a university's accessibility office. So she really understands that, but she volunteers with us on the side. And then we have our staff person has led a lot of those conversations as well. So often it's the sort of thing where the university won't talk to parents about what's going on with the student, but if the student gives permission for Dyslexia Canada to advocate on their behalf, like, we've had some success having those conversations. But yeah, definitely starting early, like you suggested, that absolutely makes sense. And if you just kind of go in there with the knowledge of, well, actually, I can push back on this a little bit, understanding that has worked for lots of other people, and that, there are human rights precedents there. Start there. And then if you need support with writing those letters or making the phone call or whatever it is, we're definitely there to support.
Thank you very much. Leora? you have a question?
Hi, yes. I was wondering, I went back to your slide about gathering information for the IEP so that we're prepared. And I'm wondering, my son's in elementary school, and I wondered what type of classroom assessments and what sort of work samples would be helpful, or if there's somewhere I can go to find the information I should have to prepare myself for the IEP meetings.
Yeah, so for me, it would be any exams or assessment. So, I think we talked about this before when you were at the last meeting, is that there should be a reading assessment 3 times a year. Now, that's not always possible. Sometimes that's very difficult for teachers because when they do their reading assessments, they have to get a sub in. So most schools do it at least twice a year. We usually do it at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the year. But at least twice a year they get assessments done. And so reading assessments, so you should be able to gather that information. If not from this grade, it should be available from last grade. There should be something on file. The other information is work samples, things that they're either bringing home or the teacher has. Alicia, do you have any other ideas?
I would say really looking at their writing, that's really telling for sure. So any independent writing samples that you have. But definitely finding out, asking what sort of reading assessments they're doing in school. So they are like teachers have to do some sort of assessment. Like that is part of the process, whether it's a formal assessment or an informal assessment, they have to have something, right, to inform their instruction. So asking at your school, like, what are the tools that they're using to measure reading? It's a whole mixed bag across British Columbia in terms of what school boards are using. Some are using some really excellent tools, some are using some not so awesome tools, but either way, there's going to be some information that you can get there from the teacher in terms of what that is, and really tracking those over time. So often that data is not going with the student from year to year. Like the teacher collects it that year, they use it to inform whatever reporting they're doing to you, and then it's not really fully passed on to the teacher the next year. So if you started a spreadsheet yourself and said, in grade 3, this is the kind of assessment they were doing, and these are the results that I got from the teacher, gathering that and then bringing that to the grade 4 teacher is going to be really helpful as well. And then having that to reflect back on in grade 5, 6, and 7, like kind of, here's the trajectory. That's important. So those are the things. And then also your own observation, like I'm sure you're reading with your child and watching your child write and that sort of thing. So bringing in all of that.
Yeah, and Alicia brought up a really good point, which I didn't mention, but having a book that you keep track of your child's IEPs and assessments and everything so that you have it in your fingertips will become invaluable to you as you go forward in the journey. Like it's really helpful to be able to share this information with new educators. And this is a great segue into the next session I'm putting on. Is in local Vancouver. If you're here, we're doing an in-person session about transitions from one classroom to the next, transition from elementary or junior high to high school, and then transition into university. So it may be a bit early for some of you to be thinking about high school, depending what grade your child's in, but if you have an idea of what to think about in the future, it's really helpful for you to be able to sort of get a good idea of what you should be talking about and thinking about now, so you're ready for those transitions as they come. And they're not just such a panic when it starts happening. And even going from one class to another class, that transition can be smoother than you can make it easier for your kid. The other thing is that I'm hoping to do a Zoom one about the transitions. What I'm finding is that it's great in Vancouver, but we've had families driving from like Richmond, which is an hour drive, just to come to these meetings. And so I think just getting the information out, the Zoom meeting is helpful. The in-person ones are always great because the parents get a chance to do sidebar conversations, and I'm not sort of tech savvy enough yet to do breakout rooms, but hopefully that will come in the future. I really want to thank everybody for coming back. What's that?
I said I can do tech support next time if you'd like.
Okay.
I'm happy to do that.
Thanks, that's awesome. I really want to thank everybody for coming. If you have any questions, let me know. I'm going